Welcome to our webinar, Lifecycle of a Deal. I'm Ryan from Pizzuli, Staff Assistant of the Institute for Energy Law, which is an institute of the Center for American and International Law. I'd like to thank IEL's online learning sponsor, Baker Botts. Its annual support of all of IEL's programs allows us to make this program free for IEL members and for law students. Today's program is hosted by the Law School Outreach Subcommittee of IEL's Young Energy Professionals Practice Committee. Our moderator today is Adam Whitehouse, of counsel at Gibson, Dunn in Houston. He is a member of the Oil and Gas, Energy Private Equity, Mergers and Acquisitions, Infrastructure and Clean Tech practice groups. Adam focuses on a variety of transactions, including advising clients on mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, joint venture arrangements, and other general corporate matters. He regularly advises clients in the energy industry, including in the upstream, midstream, and energy transition space. Additionally, he is the current secretary for IEL's Young Energy Professionals Committee. I'll now turn it over to Adam to introduce the other panelists.
Thanks, Ryan. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this summer associate panel this morning. Like Ryan said, we're going to talk about the life cycle of a deal. So you're going to learn about the typical, I say in air quotes, life cycle of an M&A transaction in the energy space. Because while no transaction is the same, this session is designed to help you better understand what you may see in the energy space. And on our panel today, we have Ryan Haddad from Reed Smith, Kit Rockwell from Jones Day, and Tiffany Taylor from Gray Reed. And now I'll turn it over to them to introduce themselves before kicking off an introduction and diving into the information that we have for you today.
Great, thanks, Adam. I guess I'll jump in. I'm like Adam said, I'm Ryan Haddad. I'm a partner at Reed Smith in Pittsburgh. My practice is primarily energy transactions. A large part of my practice is in oil and gas M&A and sort of the related financings and equity structures. And then the other bulk of my practice is in carbon capture and sequestration. So both sort of the dirt work of acquiring pore space and then project development from there.
And I'm Tiffany Taylor. I am an associate at Gray Reed in Dallas. I've been practicing for a while, but for the first 10 years of my career, I did primarily oil and gas title work. With that, I focused on nothing but upstream work. Now, in the last 3 years or so, I have transitioned my practice since joining Gray Reed, and I do a lot more M&A transactional work. I do primarily upstream still. A lot of times I'm focused more on the buy side of things, but a lot like Ryan, I have definitely run the gamut of different transactional work within the upstream and midstream transactional space. Again, traditional oil and gas primarily.
Hi, I'm Kit Rockhill. I'm a partner in the energy practice at Jones Day. I'm also co-chair of our Energy Transition and Infrastructure Initiative. So I've been practicing for about a decade. I've spanned everything from upstream all the way to downstream. I've done petrochemical work. I've done your traditional oil and gas deals. I've also done a lot of solar and battery storage and electrical vehicle type stuff as part of the transition. And primarily what I do is mergers and acquisitions in the energy space, and then a lot of joint ventures, project development work, and stuff like that as well.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. So I'll give an overview of the various topics we're going to touch on today. Then our panelists will discuss those topics in more detail. And then at the end, if we have time, we have a number of questions and topics. We thought it might be interesting to have kind of a roundtable type discussions with our panelists. And if anyone has any questions then or throughout the presentation, feel free to use to speak up and use the chat or Q&A function, and we'll try to address those questions. So to start with, we're going to take a look at and talk about the initial steps of an M&A transaction, then dive into the due diligence process, which is something you'll see a lot of and often participate in as a junior. Then we're going to touch on the definitive transaction documents, then the key ancillary documents, followed by some details about signing and closing and post-closing activities. And with that, I will turn it over to Ryan to talk about the initial steps.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I appreciate that. And I think you said this at the beginning. I'm going to give a high level overview of typical, quote unquote, typical initial steps. Again, every client is different, every deal is different. And so that means that when we get involved is often different. What we would prefer is that the initial steps of a transaction is that we are engaged, right? It is ideal for counsel to be involved at the very beginning, but that's not always the case. If you are representing a seller, for instance, in a transaction, they may engage you at the same time that they engage any sort of financial advisors that are going to be involved in the transaction. That often happens earlier in the process before buyers are involved. Buyers and sellers with sort of robust in-house legal departments may defer engagement of counsel for a period of time, and maybe at least until after they've signed a letter of intent or a term sheet. That can be a little bit risky. Again, from their perspective, they're trying to manage costs, right? From our perspective, it can be a little risky even for the most experienced clients. Because, and I know, having worked with Adam, he has seen this plenty of times. You'll receive a term sheet that's already been signed, and as counsel, you have more questions than the term sheet has answers, and it can often cause delays or acrimony as you get into the transaction. I'm thinking of until recently, Adam and I were sort of co-counsel for parties that were in a joint venture to develop assets. And we got a term sheet on a deal last year where there was, it spelled out the purchase price and what the assets were and the parameters of the deal, but it was unclear on, I think the agreement was that the buyer would have the opportunity to diligence the properties. And what it did not delineate was which properties those were. And so there was a category of oil and gas assets that are known as proved developed producing assets. Those that are, those are wells that are currently producing hydrocarbons. And it's typical that value in a deal is ascribed to those assets because they're generating dollars, and it's typical to diligence the assets that have value ascribed. But there was also a component of the deal that was the undeveloped assets, the sort of the oil and gas leases. There's no wells been drilled on. They're not developed. They're not producing money as is today, but there's potential value in the future. The way the market has worked most recently, you don't really put value on those assets, and so often we don't diligence it. And so we got, I think more than a month down the line in negotiating the transaction documents before there was even an agreement on the business deal of, whether this package was going to be involved. And, it's not mission critical, it's not the end of the world, but it's one of those things that causes additional time, delays, costs. So just something to be thinking of. Often the next step is sort of the marketing process. I mean, if you're a seller and you've decided we're going to sell this asset, and we want to enact a formal sales process, this is the next step. So this typically involves preparation of teasers that describe the assets, to start to build up interest in the deal, a portfolio book with asset descriptions, historical financials, things like that. This is often led by the investment bankers. And legal's there mostly just to make sure that A, they're in the loop, and B, that there's nothing in that teaser that's going to be a problem down the line. And that may be the time when counsel is also engaged to start developing a form purchase agreement that you're going to provide to bidders. Once teasers get distributed and parties decide that they're interested, that's when you will sign a confidentiality agreement or a non-disclosure agreement that allows potential buyers to begin to review sensitive data. I'm not going to go too far into the weeds on what you need to be looking for in an NDA. They are occasionally heavily negotiated, but oftentimes, especially from business parties' perspective, they will rubber stamp them, and we often caution against that for all the obvious reasons. In terms of next steps, once NDAs are signed, there's the preliminary diligence that occurs. That is, the buyers are going to start poking around just to determine, hey, is there value here in this asset? Is this something that we are interested in? In a competitive bid process where there's multiple bidders or multiple buyers, you're going to have a little bit more of an orderly process because you want to make sure that all of the bidders and buyers are getting access to the same information, having the opportunity to ask the same questions, all of that. In a closed bid, that's often, if a buyer approaches the seller, for instance, about selling the assets, you might be in a situation where there's just one buyer and one seller. That is often quicker and cheaper. The downside to that is, you may not know for sure that you got the highest and best value, right? And that may not be a big deal if the goal is we want to divest of liabilities. But if it's a material asset and you haven't done a formal process, it invites some questions sometimes from stakeholders, from shareholders over whether the value was sufficient. The next step is typically the bidding. That will often take the shape of a written indication of interest or bid letter from potential buyers that'll spell out things like the purchase price, any assumptions that are built into that purchase price, like the ability to acquire, all of the contracts, any contingencies that are going to be in there, a proposed closing timeline, sources of funds, and often a markup of the purchase agreement that would have been populated and shared with each of the parties. When we're representing a seller, we love requiring a markup of the PSA in a competitive process because as a bidder, you don't want to prejudice your bid by heavily marking up the agreement. And so it allows the seller to have maybe a more advantageous legal agreement going into things. If you're on the buyer side, there's tricks of the trade to sort of reserve your right to negotiate it after your bid has been accepted, but that's maybe outside the scope of this discussion. From there, you're signing letters of intent, signing term sheets. Often, if the transaction is going to be structured as a simultaneous sign and close, and we'll talk about that distinction, a deposit might be paid. The idea here is that if a bidder is for real, they'll put up some money to show that. You want to have them pot committed. You don't want to have them have the ability to just lock you up exclusively and then walk away, disrupt your business, get a look under the hood, kick the tires, to use yet another analogy, and then walk away for free. So the deposit ensures alignment because if they don't transact in good faith, then the seller can potentially keep that deposit. And also, you want to ensure that there is exclusivity if you are the buyer, right? You don't often want to be in a position where you are negotiating dual track against another bidder and having those negotiations held against you. Exclusivity is typically something that you pay for. So now we have agreed to it. We have a term sheet, we have a buyer, we have a seller, we have a purchase price. The next real question is, how do we want to structure this transaction? Is it in the oil and gas space? Often the focus is on the assets. That doesn't necessarily mean that the transaction will be structured as just an asset deal. In the sort of the highest level terms, a deal can be structured either as an acquisition of assets, right? An acquisition of oil and gas leases, wells, equipment, or it can be structured as an equity deal, so or a stock deal, an acquisition of the company itself, right? You're buying out shares rather than buying out cherry picking specific assets. And we can talk a little bit more about the specifics there. I mean, in an asset acquisition, the seller will remain the legal owner of all of the assets that are not included in the deal, and the buyer will purchase individual assets of the company like equipment, licenses, oil and gas wells, like I said, with the sales proceeds being distributed to the seller shareholders. Typically, this allows the buyer to assume a sort of finite universe of liabilities because you're going to spell out in a sales transaction what liabilities are associated with the assets, what's being assumed by the buyer, what's being retained by the seller. And so, it creates a little bit more certainty around what am I getting, what are the potential downsides. There are also plenty of tax reasons why you might want to do a deal, structure the deal as an asset transaction. I am not going to get into any of those because I only know enough to get myself into trouble. But I will stress that when structuring a transaction, the most important phone call is to your tax specialists. You want them to audit everything that you're doing to make sure you don't make a decision, today that in 6 months causes tax liability to your client. Some disadvantages to the asset transaction structure are around transferability, right? If there are consent rights attached to an asset or a contract, if there are rights of first refusal, if there are consents that need to be granted, those typically have to be dealt with before you can transfer the asset. The other piece of it is, if there are key employees that are working on an asset, you then need to negotiate for the transfer of employees, which just adds another complicating factor to the transaction. On the other side, you have a stock purchase agreement, and this includes the typical the merger. But again, the stock transaction is going to be an acquisition of the underlying stock. The advantage, so obviously you then acquire the assets as part of that transaction. The advantages are it's often simpler. You're acquiring membership interests or shares or partnership interests rather than acquiring the assets. And there may be some distinction in terms of what level of diligence you're able to do in an asset transaction versus a stock transaction. And it also obviates the need to go through a lot of the same sort of consent processes. I mean, in more sort of sophisticated agreements, they will have closed they call it a Texas two-step loophole, where you transfer assets into an entity and then transfer the equity rather than transferring the assets themselves, to avoid incurring sort of consent obligations. In more sophisticated agreements, they'll say, well, it's if you're effectively transferring the assets, if there's a change of control over the assets, then we have consent rights. And that's something that the partner structuring the deal will be thinking about when they come up with how we're going to sort of do this deal. And then you'll get involved as a junior associate in what are the consents, what are the consent rights, what do we need to do in order to transact here. I don't want to go too far into the weeds on sort of merger structures, but often a stock purchase is going to take the form of a merger, whether that's the target company merging into the buyer entity or the merger of the target entity into a subsidiary of the acquiring entity. I mean, there's tax reasons why you might structure it one way versus the other, but really as an operational matter, you're concerned about how do we integrate this new entity as seamlessly as possible. A direct merger, a merger of a target company into a buyer is often an easier path, but it's kind of the proverbial rock into a pond, right? You're just sort of dropping this new company into an existing structure and figuring out how does it fit. Whereas if you do a subsidiary merger, you sort of have sequestered this new asset as a wholly owned sub of your company, and then you can sort of have a more orderly transition. Let me just very quickly, and then I will hand it off to Tiffany. Talk very briefly about the simultaneous sign and close versus the delayed sign and close. That's a term that you're going to hear a lot early on. It's one that when I was a baby lawyer, I really struggled with. I would get the email from a partner that would say, hey, we're actually going to do this as a simultaneous sign and close. Can you convert the agreement? And I would tear my hair out about what needs to stay in here and what needs to come out. But the distinction here is when you do a simultaneous sign and close, what you're doing is you're negotiating a purchase agreement, and on the day that you sign that agreement, you are also closing. So the same day that you sign the agreement that has all the reps and warranties and all of the indemnity language, you are also going to actually transfer ownership of the assets. You're going to exchange money, and the deal will close the same day you sign. And that's really useful in a scenario where there's limited due diligence. You don't expect to need any regulatory approvals. There's no consents that need to be granted. There's no debt on the assets that need to be released. There's limited commodity risk, and the buyer we know has the money to close. You might, on the other hand, prefer a delayed sign and close, and that would be one where you sign the agreement and the agreement says A, B, and C needs to happen, and when they do, we can close the transaction, we'll exchange money and transfer the asset. That's often more applicable if you have robust due diligence. The deal that I was talking about that Adam and I were on included, fairly significant due diligence. So you signed a purchase agreement that said, here's the scope of the diligence, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do. And so you sign the agreement, and then you have 30 or 60 days to due diligence, and then you can close. That's also applicable if there are regulatory consents that need to be granted, or if if the buyer is financing the deal, they might need to sign the agreement and then go shop for financing, in which case you would have a financing contingency that says, when the buyer has the money, we'll close. So those are some of the considerations. I've probably taken up more time, so I want to hand it over to Tiffany, but obviously if there's any questions, happy to talk about them later on.
I think that was great, Ryan. In the same way that Ryan was trying to provide a high-level overview, my ultimate goal is to not use a bunch of acronyms that I don't define what I'm talking about. Because as an associate, that was one of the most complex things for me is you just hear all these acronyms thrown around and you end up feeling really dumb having to jump on Google and try to figure out what they are or ask another attorney that you work with. So what I'd like to discuss today is just the process of due diligence. You'll hear it called due diligence, due dil, or just DD. This is the chance for a buyer in a transaction to really dive deep into the assets or the business that they're looking to acquire. It's probably one of the most thorough reviews that a seller is going to go through, and it can be kind of painful for the seller to compile all the documents, have everything organized, and really just be an open book. And ultimately, when as the seller you're putting the deal out there, whether it's marketed or not, you're providing the shiny picture of what things look like. Due diligence is really the opportunity, like Ryan said, to kick the tires and dig in to see what's actually underneath the surface. What do the contracts say? What do the assets actually look like? I like to liken it to the discovery process in the transactional world. And so the scope of what due diligence looks like is really going to depend on whether it's an asset level transaction or an entity level transaction. And what your role is going to be determined by whether you're the buyer or the seller. So who has all the information? The seller. Their goal is going to be compiling all of the data related to what this transaction is going to look like. It could be financials, it could be production reports, it could be contracts, it's going to be environmental reports. And so everything is going to need to be organized. How long does this take? Sometimes it can be a matter of a few days. That's when you often have those sign and close transactions, just because it's quick to go through all of the data related to the transaction. It can be a few weeks, it can be a few months, depending on the scope of the deal, the complexity of it, whether it's asset or entity level, and just really the volume of what's going to have to be reviewed, what sort of financial thresholds are going to be met, is really going to determine how long it takes. So you need to make sure that when you're structuring these deals and getting into it, that you really kind of allow enough time based on the complexity of the deal. You need to kind of know what's coming, per se. So how is it conducted? Like Ryan said, once you get that letter of intent signed and you have the non-disclosure signed, the buyer typically will provide a due diligence checklist. It's what they're looking for. It will often be very, very lengthy and complicated. Sometimes 20 pages worth of requests. And it's going to depend on the transaction. It may ask for financials, legal contracts, operational information, HR, the main functions of the business. But at the end of the day, the seller is going to need to provide as much as they can in response, but the buyer is ultimately going to have their short list of really the things that are critical to them. So the seller may turn over information, the buyer's going through it and realizes they're not providing me the specific thing I'm looking for. So you may have the initial checklist, you may have the initial request, and then ultimately, once you've received the first set of information, you may also end up submitting supplemental requests. These requests should be organized, and the responses should also match the organization. Sometimes it might be beneficial for a seller ahead of the transaction to actually do a sort of dummy due diligence, just to kind of get their files in order, just to be able to make sure that they know what's missing, if anything. If they have legacy assets that they haven't fully gone through all the files or don't know how it was organized from a prior entity, this is an opportunity to kind of get your ducks in a row. It helps you avoid major surprises on the seller side, that there may be holes that you don't know exist. And it's also an opportunity for you to discuss with counsel ahead of time when to disclose these items in the process so that there's no surprises, the deal doesn't die as a result of it. And ultimately, the better organization that you have, the more confidence that the buyer is going to have in your company and the assets. So it's always a good plan of attack to really just understand the organization that's required here. When it comes to putting the files together, what does this look like? If you're on the seller side, there are services that you can engage to organize all of the data. You can set up a share file. It can be a little more informal through Dropbox folders, Google Documents, and sometimes it may just be a bunch of boxes of data. I have been in multiple scenarios, some that are far more organized than others, and sometimes it literally resulted in me, in representing the seller, having to call random employee contacts to say, hey, so-and-so says that you have a box with this information in it. Can you mail it to my office? And trying to really sift through extremely unorganized files to create some semblance of organization to pass off to the buyer. What kind of things is a buyer going to be looking for? If it's an entity level transaction, they're going to want to know, they want org charts. They're going to want to see financials, profit and loss statements, income statements, tax returns. And then from the other side, if we're looking at the assets, you're going to be looking at contracts, permits, leases. And like Ryan said, it's all diving in to see, like, what are the obligations that you would be incurring through either the purchase of the entity or the asset. Another big piece of due diligence is also environmental analysis. So you'll hear the acronym ESA. It's an environmental site assessment. And this is kind of broken out into a phase 1 assessment and a phase 2 assessment. So we'll talk about phase 1 first. It's really an phase 1 ESA is really an opportunity just to kind of get the surface level picture of what kind of environmental liabilities might you be incurring by taking on these assets. Typically, you're looking at a cost of around $5,000 per site. The turnaround time to get the reports on those is around 20 business days. It can be expedited to land around the 10 business day mark. But really what that phase 1 consists of is a very surface level review. It's a review of maps. It's a review of historical data, the title, what has the land been used for? Are there any data gaps in time? And then it also includes an on-site review. It'll just be eyes on the ground. They're looking for open storage tanks, evidence of leaching, big giant brown circles where there's no grass because things have died because there's something underground causing it. Why do these? The buyer wants to know what they're getting into, because once you buy it, you own it, and for the most part, the liability is yours. It's your opportunity to satisfy any sort of regulatory requirements, and oftentimes a lender will have a requirement that phase 1s are done on assets. If there's something that comes across in this phase 1 analysis, it'll be what's called an REC, a recognized environmental condition. Those are bad. That's when the report shows that something is coming up that could cause an environmental liability. We don't know what it is from a surface level review, but it's really typically going to come with a recommendation that a phase 2 be done on that asset. And so phase 2 comes along. That's the more in-depth review of the environmental conditions on a site. It includes sampling and testing. Those are going to cost around $10,000 to $20,000. And really the timing on that, and this is kind of tying back to the timeline of structuring the transaction, the timeline can really vary. If a rig is going to be required to go do some sort of core sampling, then you're at the mercy of rig availability. And then also just how long is it going to take a lab to produce their report? Typically, you're looking at around 30-day average just for the phase 2. And it's possible if phase 2 are required that you may have to do a little bit of reevaluation of the timeline needed for this deal. Also, depending on what turns up in the phase 2, it could mean that you have some obligations to handle reporting to regulators depending on the jurisdiction that you're in. Some complicating factors in this is that sometimes sellers may actually create restrictions on access, and also if you have a third-party operator, that may cause some issues with actually having access to the site for a phase 2. So what's your role in this? Jumping into these, I know there's a lot of information, but ultimately, in line with the whole legal field, the answer is it depends. That's your role. So I've done plenty of mineral buying acquisitions, and so my primary role in those looked like title review. I went through all of the deeds that pertain to a piece of property or multiple pieces of property, and I'm trying to go through a specific seller's chain of title to determine what they own. What is it the buyer would be acquiring? What are any concerns that the buyer should have in questions of what the total interest being purchased might look like? It may also look like a review of a giant data dump of contracts. You might have joint operating agreements or JOAs. Unit designations, analyzing terms of letter agreements that date back far longer than you want to review, cooperation agreements, and you're going through those to really kind of dive into what are the contents of them, what are the obligations that you're incurring, what are you going to be responsible for handling going forward, what minimum volume commitments might you have. And so for me, I create a lot of spreadsheets detailing what the contract is, where it can be found within the files, what are the terms of the contracts that I'm going through, are there any pref rights, are there any consents, and really what you're doing with all of that is you're analyzing the data that you've seen and you're trying to match what you're buying with what the valuation of each of the assets is going to be. You're going to be looking at production data. I've been in a situation where the lender had certain financial thresholds to meet. We were trying to check off the boxes of, the valuation of each of the wells to make sure that we could meet those minimum thresholds. And my role in the due diligence process, due to my background in title, actually looked like me going through well files, pulling leases on each individual tract that fell within a well to verify all of the pieces there and trying to check the boxes for $1,000 at a time just to meet that minimum threshold requirement, along with a giant team of landmen and brokers. So what your role looks like absolutely depends on what you're purchasing, what data is coming to your group. There will be internal people working on the same thing simultaneously. Who else is involved? You've got lenders. They're going to have those thresholds. They're going to have their requirements. You're going to have regulatory. Those boxes have to be checked. You're on the legal side. You're trying to check the boxes on your end. Everybody has a different role that they're trying to check boxes for. And it can be absolutely fast and furious with timelines that you're trying to meet. So at the end of the day, you've looked through all of this information. You've compiled so many spreadsheets. You've read so many pages of data. And And then what does that leave you with? Your client has to kind of start making decisions of what can we live with in terms of risk, and what risks are we unwilling to accept, at least on the buy side. And that kind of leads to the defect process. And Kit's going to get into that in her presentation. But really, it's taking all of this data and trying to figure out what are we going to do with it. And so that's where Kit comes in, and she's going to talk through actually structuring all of the agreements.
Okay, thanks, Tiffany. Again, like everyone said, I'm going to try and keep this super high level. One of the things that you'll find when you start working is that a partner will ask you to do something and they'll say, oh, hey, can you check this representation for me? It should be in Article 3, or it should be in Article 4. It should be an indemnification in Article 10. And you're going to think, oh my God, they're so on top of everything. They know all these agreements back to forth and all ways to sideways. And it's because all of these agreements follow the same basic structure. So pretty much your purchase price is always going to be in Article 3 in every agreement that you do. So what is the structure of a purchase agreement? What generally is contained in it? First thing up front you're going to have is, what are you buying or selling, right? The description of the assets, the descriptions of the stock to be sold. Right after that, you're going to have, how much are you paying for it? And how are you not going to pay for it? What are you not going to pay for? So an example for that would be the defect process that Tiffany mentioned. Hey, we found this thing that's concerning in diligence. We're going to take a harder look at it. And if these things come out of that phase 2, our purchase price goes down. Something else that may come out of diligence is there's this really, really important contract that has a consent right on it. If you don't get the consent to give us that contract, the purchase price goes down. You can also have an indication where the purchase price goes up. Hey, we've got what's called working capital, right? It's your bills in and out of the business. Nobody has every bill due on the same date every month. So when you close, you have to be a period of time afterwards for those bills to come in and the bills to go out. And then you sit there and you say, okay, well, this is how much money was actually in the business on the day that we closed. We've reconciled it. We've paid all the bills. We've gotten all our payments in. Hey, there's more money than you thought. You have to pay me, buyer, the extra if I'm the seller. And if you're the buyer, you go, well, I got more value. You increase the purchase price. After that comes your representations and warranties of your seller and or the target company if you're doing a stock deal. This I would think of as your product description on a website, right? You're buying a blue t-shirt that is a size medium that is from this material. It's the same thing in a purchase agreement. You are buying these assets. They have been maintained in this way. They have these environmental characteristics. They have these business things and these contracts associated with it. These are all your statements about it. This is where you are going to be having a lot of role and impact as a junior associate coming in, because this is where the diligence really informs the purchase agreement. It will inform what statements are made, what you find that you want the other side to make sure that they're making representations about, or what you as a seller want to be able to protect yourself about. Don't get mad at me about that brown patch. I told you about it. You saw it. We all agreed it wasn't a big deal. I don't want to hear about it later. So these statements are also the ways that if you are the buy side and you are not getting what you are sold, you have some recourse down the line. And that recourse can be purchase price adjustment, that recourse can be indemnification, or that recourse could be insurance. So one of the things that's interesting about reps and warranties of the seller is that there are market reps and warranties. There is kind of bounds around what you will typically see and what statements both buyers and sellers are willing to make and accept. However, there are different markets depending on where you are. So if you are dealing with a cross-border transaction and you are selling to somebody in Europe, you're going to see that they expect much more expansive reps than you may be willing to give in the US. You will also see a difference based on who the parties to the contract are. If you're dealing with a competitive auction or you're dealing with a private equity buyer, they're going to generally buy something that's called rep and warranty insurance. It literally is buying insurance against you lying in the reps and warranties. And so that insurance carrier will look at all the reps and warranties and then say, if any of these things are untrue, you can make a claim against us, the insurance company. What that means is that the seller is going to make a lot more statements that they would be willing to have because the insurance carrier is going to pay for it, not the seller. Whereas if the seller is on the hook, then the seller is going to have a lot more negotiation on these contracts back and forth. You will generally see that if you have strategics, which in the oil and gas space, a lot of your traditional upstream stuff when you're dealing with wells, your midstreams that you're dealing with pipelines, a lot of that is going to be with strategic buyers. They're going to expect you to stand behind it. They're going to expect if they're buying something that you are going to stand behind what it is. And if you're selling something, they're going to stand behind it because there's no reason for them to go to rep and warranty insurance. They have the balance sheet that they can stand behind the risk they're willing to take. So you'll find that this area is one of the most deal dependent areas of a purchase agreement that you're going to have. It will be very uniquely tailored. While there are standard concepts, that will be very uniquely tailored to the deal. After the reps and warranties on what is being bought, you have the reps and warranties on who is buying it. Typically that is, I'm a real person, I have authority to do the deal, and I've got the money to do it. Those are pretty much the suite of what you've got on the buy side. You will see in certain types of deals either disclaimers of reps and warranties if you're doing an as is, where is deal. You will also see sometimes if you are dealing with a foreign party, you will see certain reps about sanctions, compliance, authority to invest in the US, stuff like that. After that, the other thing that's almost in every deal is your indemnification. So I talked about what is the recourse if there's something wrong in the reps and warranties. What is the recourse if you just aren't doing what you're doing and you're breaching the agreement? That's going to be your indemnification provision. Your indemnification provision is sometimes also called like an insurance policy. That's also going to be very heavily negotiated, and that's going to be pretty tied to the value of the deal. And the idea there is that on bigger deals, right, if you're doing a half a billion dollar deal, it's $500 million. They are not going to want you to come to them if 3 screws fall out on something and they can go to Home Depot and get it. And you as a seller are going to say, it's $15. This is a $500 million deal. Why are you bothering me with this? Now, if those 3 screws fall out and an entire tank collapses and all of a sudden this is a $2 million claim, yes, seller, you said you did the maintenance on that, and yet these screws are loose and they popped out, and now we have a Boeing situation. So they're going to want to have some sort of recourse to you saying, we did not get what we thought we paid for. And as a seller, you're saying, that's where your reps and warranties come in. You got exactly what you paid for. Here's where I told you. So indemnification is just how you do that. That is normally structured as either caps, baskets, deductibles. Deductible, just like your car insurance. A deal has to be this big before you even come talk to me about it. And that's the amount that you eat before I pay anything on top of it. A basket or a tipping basket, a lot of times is what you'll hear is it has to reach that threshold. But once it reaches that threshold, you can claim all of your damages all the way back down to $1. Caps are pretty much saying on these deals, like, we're going to negotiate that, fine, I will be exposed for all of these things, but here's a limit to my exposure. The reason for that is because as a seller, you want to really understand once you sell something, what is your ongoing risk? What is the most that you could possibly come back to on that deal? And that's your cap. Now, those are all for your typical reps and warranties. Then there are things called fundamental reps and warranties. This is, I have authority to do the deal. I own what I am selling. I'm not breaking the law by selling it to you. Those types of things. And so for all of those, the idea is, I don't care about caps. I don't care about baskets. I don't care if it's $1. This is basically a fraud. You told me you owned it, you sold it to me, and you don't. And now I don't own it, and this is a problem. Those generally are outside of the caps and the baskets, and they're sort of $1, and you go back to the beginning. Now, on a lot of the fundamental reps, you will have what's called a purchase price cap, which essentially says, if I told you I could sell it to you, and now I can't, I will give you your money back. There are some exceptions for that. That's normally when you get into sort of things like fraud or intentional misconduct. But those are generally the way those things are structured. You will also have in almost every deal what's called post-closing covenants. So if you're going to buy a company, you're not going to turn around on day one and immediately have full control. You know everything. Everything's great. There's some things that you're going to have to handle afterwards, right? There may be government filings where you're going to need the seller's help. There may be transition matters. You may have a transition services agreement that handles it. You may say, if I'm buying assets from this guy who's built up a business over 30 years and I'm going to buy everything he owns, I want to make sure he doesn't turn around, steal all my customers, and build the exact same business next door. So you'll have non-competes. You may have non-solicits. If I'm hiring all your employees as part of buying your business, you can't turn around and poach them back to me, right? That's something that Tesla is currently dealing with X. You want to have those sorts of non-competes and non-solicits, and those will generally be post-closing covenants. So for a period of time after the closing, you cannot do certain things. You will also have, for a period of time after the closing, you have to do certain things. A lot of what you buy in the oil and gas space are physical assets. They are wells, they are tanks, they are any of the other things that Ryan and Tiffany have talked about, which means that if you drive by that storage tank, the seller probably had a placard on it with their name on it. Well, after closing, you want someone to take that placard off and put the buyer's name on there. You have a lot of these things are flammable, right? So you have to register with the emergency authorities. So if something goes wrong, they know who to call. You have to switch those over to the buyer so that they're not calling the seller in 2 years if a tank blows up. So you'll have also things that you have to do after closing. You have to cooperate with filing, stuff like that. And then if you have what Ryan was talking about, a delayed close, right? I'm going to sign this agreement. We're going to take these steps and then we're going to close the deal. If you have that interim period, you have to have something that basically says, all right, how do we protect the value of what is going on? What does the company have to do? What can't the company do? And what do we do if it all goes wrong? And then how do we get to closing? So pre-closing covenants are generally your interim covenants. If you have a deal that has to get governmental approval for something. So most of our energy deals, this is big money, big numbers. They're probably going to trigger an HSR filing. So if you have to go to the government and and that's Hart-Scott-Rodino, it's an antitrust filing, basically. If you have to go to the government and get permission to close the deal, that generally is at least 30 days. You have to get that permission before you are allowed to close, or else you are breaking the law. So you will have an entire provision about how do you approach the government? What are the requirements? What do you have to do to get permission? Do you have to sell an entire division of your existing company? So you'll have a whole provision on that. You'll have a whole provision on operations, right? If you're buying a car and they're delivering it a month later, I want to make sure you're still doing the oil changes. I want to make sure you're still doing the tire pressure, right? Your general maintenance. You're going to have operations that say you have to continue to operate the company the way that you've done. You have to continue to do maintenance. You have to continue to use your budget the way that you were going to, so that what I buy is in the same condition as the day I agreed to buy it. You will also have things on what not to do, right? You can't fire your biggest customer. You can't stop paying vendors. You have to kind of do all of the things to keep the value of that business as static as possible during the interim period. And then you're going to have conditions precedent. Conditions precedent are, what do we do to get to closing? When do we know we're going to close? Everyone's going to want to close as soon as possible. So they're going to say, as soon as we get that government filing, that permission from HSR, as soon as we get the consents on these contracts that we have listed in a schedule, as soon as all of these come in, as soon as we have this third thing happening with maybe you have some sort of monetary financing that's coming in. Once those three things are happening, then X number of days later, we close. And you have the X number of days later because you want to make sure that there is an objective timeline as to when closing is going to happen. You hit the conditions, you satisfy the conditions, you close X number of days after that. So those are the conditions precedent. Then you have termination. What happens if during the interim period, this all goes very, very wrong? What do you do if the federal government says you can't close? Okay, well, you have an agreement to close now. How do you get out of that without breaching it? That's where termination comes. If you're the seller, you have an agreement to sell it to them. Federal government just told me I can't. I don't want this asset anymore. How do I sell it to someone else? So you're going to have termination provisions. Those will generally be related to massive breaches of the agreement or massive breach of the representation. It will be related to government filings that don't come in if you don't get certain permissions, or it will be related to what's called a casualty event. And we actually had this happen where the day before closing, a refinery that we were supposed to close on kind of went massive fire. All of a sudden, what does that mean? So termination will be a set number of listed events. There will be a limited number of events that you can walk away from. And depending on what that event is, we'll say, hey, you know that down payment that I made via the deposit that Ryan talked about? Yeah, the federal government said we couldn't close. I want my money back. Whereas certain other things will say, hey, it didn't work out. That's cool. I'm keeping the deposit to reimburse me for my time as the seller, and then I'm going to go sell it to someone else because I spent all this time in you. This is my essentially insurance policy on it. You'll sometimes also hear that called a break fee. I can't talk. Break fee, which is where you either keep the deposit or you pay some certain amount of money for breaking up. That's kind of how all of these are generally structured as you walk through it. And like I said, the biggest part for you is going to be on your reps and warranties. That's the biggest part that you're going to be doing. When you close, what does that look like? It's not just the purchase agreement for, hey, we bought these things. Yay, I'm the owner. That is true, but you have to actually move the ownership over. And so, like we said, a lot of oil and gas, a lot of energy, you are buying and selling physical stuff. So you have to transfer ownership of permits. You have to transfer the actual land from one person to the other. And so you'll have ancillary agreements that actually move that stuff over. A lot of times these are called assignment and assumption agreements, or if you're dealing with land, you'll have deeds. And those are they're normally in a delayed close negotiated as exhibits to the purchase agreement so that when the time comes for closing, you're just filling in names and dates and then sending them off. But that's the actual operative agreements that will transfer the ownership over. Part of those, you may have your non-competes that we talked about, maybe ancillary agreements. You're going to have certain things you have to do for the IRS, right? To make sure that we don't have to do tax withholdings. You're going to have closing certificates that say one of the requirements for me to close is that all my reps and warranties still have to be true. So I'm going to have an officer of the other side certified that all of their reps and warranties are still true. So you have something formal in writing affirming that that condition precedent has been met. You'll see a lot of that. What does that mean for what you are actually doing? Taking these ancillary agreements, doing first drafts of them, turning them into the closing documents, that's typically something that a junior associate will do. The other thing that a junior associate will typically be doing is saying, there's all this stuff that's got to get done, right? We have to make these filings, we have to ask for these consents, we have to prepare these documents, we have to get these things. You as a junior associate will be tasked with doing what's called a closing checklist. It is literally a giant to-do list of all the things that you have to do to get to closing so that you can go down and check all of them off. That's something that is very typical for a junior associate to be tasked with drafting, is reading the purchase agreement and creating a master to-do list for both sides to follow on everything that needs to get done for you to get to closing. If you're doing a project, you'll also sometimes have what's called punch lists. This is something that generally comes out of diligence and says, hey, the maintenance is bad on this one tank. I want to make sure you're fixing X, Y, and Z before it's done. It's similar to if you have ever heard or seen someone buy a house where they say, hey, you got to fix the roof and replace the shutters before closing. That's a punch list. The punch list would be an item on your closing checklist. So it would be kind of a separate sub to-do list that you would run into. Those are kind of the big things that you'll see in terms of the things that will drive timing. Like I said, it's regulatory approvals. It's getting those consents. Ryan mentioned debt. If you have assets that are collateral on debt, you're going to have to get the financer to release those assets so that you can sell them. And if you're the buyer, you don't want to buy something that if somebody else defaults on a loan, they can take away from you. So you're going to want to get payoff letters. Funds flows are literally what they sound like. It is something that tracks how is the money going to move on the day of closing, especially when you are dealing with amounts of this size. Those get held up by the Fed if you don't have them processed in advance. So you're going to want to do something called a penny test, where literally the buyer and seller will send pennies back and forth to the different bank accounts in writing to make sure that everything is good. We did have an issue moving money out of Europe once where they forgot to tell their European bank that they were sending millions of dollars to the US. That caused a delay in closing for about 3 hours. So you're going to want to have funds flow. You're going to want to detail when are funds moving, how are they moving, what bank account are they going into, how much money is moving. Remember, we talked about purchase price adjustments. If that purchase price is going up or down, we have to make sure that we're adjusting the dollar amount that is actually moving on the day of closing. And then you're going to exchange signatures. Somebody who is very super important at the buyer and the seller is going to be signing a whole bunch of documents, attesting to all these things, executing the agreements, certifying that everything has been met. In order to get those signatures, you need to think on timing. Holidays, right? We're coming up on Juneteenth in 2 days. You can't close a deal on Wednesday. If you're going to have everybody out of the office, you need to get those signatures on Tuesday. If you're dealing with a foreign counterpart, they're going to have different holidays than you, and you need to make sure that you get the signatures in advance. That's something that as a junior associate that you'll typically be tasked with doing, is they will send signatures from the other side, and you will be looking, making sure, do we have a signature for every document that we need to have a document for? Do we have the right person who is signing it? Okay, check all that off. Do we have it all in time for closing? Yes, that's something that will be on your task. Creating the signature pages for your client will be on your task. I've got, we are having this person sign. He needs to sign these 15 documents. Here they are in a lovely little PDF. I'm going to send them to the person on the other side who is very important. They can print them out. They can sign them. They can scan them and send them back to you. If you're dealing with land stuff, you may have to do local counsel. You may have to have actual physical paper signatures where you have to mail them to each other because you have to do it for filing in records and stuff like that. But that's all stuff that you will be tasked as a junior associate with coordinating. That's kind of how the deals are structured. A lot of the provisions that you're going to run into, that you're going to be asked to help with. I know we have 3 minutes left, which is why we're all talking so quickly. So I will open it up for questions or throw it back to Adam if he has any closing remarks he wants to say to close it out.
Thanks, Kit and Ryan and Tiffany. Seeing no questions currently, since we just have 3 minutes left, I think we can wrap it up there. So thank you to our great panelists, and thank you everyone